Introductory Concepts in American Government. What are the powers of Congress? The powers of the United States Congress are outlined in Article 1 of the Constitution. There are two types of congressional powers: enumerated powers, which are powers expressly written in the Constitution, and implied powers, which are powers derived from, though not explicitly stated in, the Constitution. The enumerated powers of Congress are mostly found in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. Article 1 lists the judicial, economic, national security, regulatory, and administrative powers of Congress. In addition to the explicitly listed powers found in Article 1, Section 8, the language of the Constitution also speaks to those actions that are underlying the enumerated powers. Two important sources of the implied powers of Congress include the Necessary and Proper Clause and the Commerce Clause. The Necessary and Proper Clause states that the Congress shall have power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. Does the clause constitute an additional grant of power to Congress beyond the enumerated powers? Or does the clause merely affirm the explicit powers provided to Congress? Let's look at a landmark decision. After Congress chartered the Second Bank of the United States in 1816, the state of Maryland attempted to impose taxes on that bank. James McCulloch, a cashier at the Baltimore branch, refused to pay the tax. Maryland sued McCulloch, trying to collect the debt, but McCulloch refused, saying it was unconstitutional. After several appeals, McCulloch v. Madison eventually made its way to the Supreme Court. McCulloch v. Maryland asked some important questions. Did the court have the authority to establish such a bank? Did the imposition of a tax by Maryland law interfere with the power of Congress? The court upheld that national government is supreme. The ruling interpreted the Necessary and Proper Clause as an additional grant of authority and served as a key element in the expansion of congressional power. According to the Commerce Clause, the Congress shall have power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. The Constitution empowered Congress to regulate commercial activity that occurred across state lines. However, definitions of commercial activity and interstate have evolved over time. The power implied by the Commerce Clause has evolved via the Supreme Court's interpretation in several important cases. Notable Commerce Clause rulings include Gibbons v. Ogden in 1824, Wickard v. Filburn in 1942, Heart of Atlanta Motel v. United States in 1964, and Gonzales v. Reich in 2005. Generally, interpretation of the Commerce Clause via these cases has broadened the scope of how Congress may invoke its commerce power. The case of Wickard v. Filburn addressed the question, does the Commerce Clause extend congressional authority to the production of wheat for personal consumption, rather than commercial, interstate activity? The Supreme Court ruled that individual production of agricultural products affect the overall demand for such products and therefore constitute activity that is under the umbrella of the Commerce Clause. The case of Gonzales v. Reich addressed the question, does the Commerce Clause empower Congress to regulate personal medical marijuana? Using a logic similar to Wickard, the Supreme Court ruled that Congress did have the power to regulate local activity, such as growing medicinal marijuana, because such activity has the potential to affect interstate commercial activity. There have been recent restrictions to the Commerce Clause. In 1995's Lopez v. United States, The Supreme Court ruled that Congress went beyond its constitutional authority in regulating firearms in local schools via the Commerce Clause. This ruling overturned the Gun-Free Zones Act of 1990. In 2000, in the case of United States v. Morrison, the Supreme Court echoed the Lopez decision and maintained that such a law was beyond the scope of the Commerce Clause, citing the local nature of such crimes. The ruling overturned the Violence Against Women Act of 1994. Summary. What are the powers of Congress? Article 1 of the Constitution enumerates the explicit powers of Congress. The power of Congress has expanded beyond the enumerated powers because of broad interpretations of the Necessary and Proper Clause and the Commerce Clause. McCulloch v. Maryland in 1819 established that the Necessary and Proper Clause constituted an additional grant of congressional power. The interpretation of the Commerce Clause has evolved to broaden congressional authority over the years. Recently, the Supreme Court has chosen to limit the congressional commercial authority.